So I think by the end of this video, we're going to be done sculpting pore level detail into our sculpture. That's a big deal. But the last thing we need to cover is adding creases and wrinkles. And the reason I like to wait till the end, after I've got all of the skin generic pore detail stamped onto the surface, is because our crease brush, which we can enable with Shift C, not only pushes into the surface at a very sharp fall off. As you can see, we're using the sharp preset so it comes to a point, but also in the brush settings, there is a pinch option. So the brush pushes in and pinches together. And I actually like to increase this effect to about 0.7 whenever doing this, but it's that pinch motion that's going to pull that pore detail into the crease. And that's very realistic when you look at photographic reference. That's what happens in a wrinkle in real life. So it's best to do this after we have that first layer of pore detail down. And let's go over, the kinds of wrinkles we're going to be looking for. Obviously, the most prominent are going to be on the forehead, as we see here. Also, the neck wrinkles. And commonly, if we maximize this reference, commonly you'll see a crease in the nasolabial fold, but usually a bit more subtle. Also in the eyelids, like the crow's feet, these subtle wrinkles emanating toward the cheek. Those places are the most obvious wrinkle locations, but we're also going to add at least very subtle wrinkles in all the places where the surface kind of comes into a valley. So let's start with the forehead, since that's the most obvious. All right, I'll switch over to my pen. And using the crease brush, I want to make sure to disable X symmetry. You do not want these to be symmetrical, except in the most extremes, like the far side of the face, I might enable symmetry. But really the creases is a good time to go completely asymmetrical. They're pretty easy to notice. And let's see, I'm just realizing that I never switched my view back to the higher value. Let's go to 85. But okay, now I'm not quite so fisheye. And when it comes to the forehead wrinkles, I'm going to start subtle and then increase the strength while I decrease the brush radius. So keeping an eye on our reference, these wrinkles rarely stretch from one temporal ridge to the other. All right, they often break in the middle or only cover a shorter distance in between that span. So I'm going to start holding control, and then you also want to start lightly pushing down on your pen at the beginning of the stroke, and then increase pressure towards the middle and lessen your pressure towards the end of the stroke. Okay, you don't want it to be consistent pressure the entire time. That's also a pretty obvious giveaway most of the time. So I just did a short one, and then I'll do a longer one in the middle. Probably should have made that a little bit bigger. Let me undo that, try again. All right, start lightly, push down harder, and then lighten up as I get to the end of the stroke. I'm also following the brow shape, right? So it starts up, and then it dips down and starts back up again. So I'm kind of making my wrinkles follow that pattern, though it doesn't have to. Sometimes it'll break the pattern a little bit. Here I'll continue that first crease, but breaking it in the middle. And then maybe add one more up at the top like this. All right, I'm being very subtle. We'll break it and then pull it back down towards the other side, okay? So all in all, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wrinkles. And we've started off soft. Now I'm going to increase the strength to like 0.5 and decrease the brush radius. And I'm going to go over that same set of wrinkles, but a little bit stronger and a little bit finer. Now, you don't want to be too uniform in this process. That's something I struggled with in the past, not breaking up the wrinkles like I am here. And if they follow too much of a pattern, they end up feeling a little bit fake. So this can take a little bit of practice till you get right, but obviously following the reference is going to be the best guidance. And so after finishing the second pass, the last pass is going to be an even smaller brush radius. I'm looking at 4 pixels, and I think 0.5 at the brush strength is going to be fine. And this time I'm going to cut small in the center of these wrinkles. All right, so this is going to be a very fine crease in the middle. But you don't want to be too smooth with this. It's okay to kind of branch off a little bit, get a touch squiggly with it. kind of jitter your hand as you go slightly. All right, I feel like my brush is not quite strong enough, or I'm not just pushing hard enough. And then continue with the other wrinkles. Another benefit about having the skin pattern pore detail already in there is it's not going to make it easy for your stroke to be too smooth. So it should naturally kind of break it up and keep it organic, which is what you want. All right, so the same principle, lightly starting your stroke and then increasing pressure in the middle of the stroke. And then again, breaking the pattern, breaking your path is a good idea. Okay, I think those read pretty well in terms of the crease portion. Now what I like to do with these deeper wrinkles, especially on the forehead and the neck, I'll switch back to my standard sculpt brush, not the stamp brush, but sculpt draw. Take my brush way down to like, I don't know, 0.2, maybe even 0.15, and lightly build up some volume on the top portion above our creases. You don't want to go too strong with this because then it'll start to feel expressive, like the brows are raised and causing the creases to compress on themselves. You don't want that feeling, but just a little bit of extra volume sells the crease more realistically. Okay, I think that has worked out pretty well. And as I move out of the forehead, the secondary thing I'm keeping in mind at this stage is subtle crease details to emphasize facial structure and facial anatomy. All right, let me show you what I mean. In between the superciliary arch and the glabella, there's often a little dimple. You can see it here. And so if I take my crease brush, Shift C, keep it fairly large and just lightly hold control and touch right here. All right, you can see how that little crease was added. Let me undo. That's what it was before and after. Let's do the same thing to the other side. Unique on both sides. That will help with asymmetry. And that little, pop, little touch of the crease brush does a lot to increase the organic facial structure. And we're going to continue that idea broadly wherever we see facial structure kind of lacking. It's kind of like a garnish almost. So here on the infraorbital rim, just lightly touch. It's a little too strong. Let's take it down to like 0.5. Same thing on the other side, but uniquely. All right, just that little touch kind of pulls those pores together and increases the fidelity of the underlying anatomy. And so I'm going to do that, or at least keep it in mind throughout this entire wrinkle creation process. All right, moving down into the alar crease, we'll do the same thing, kind of tighten this up. It got a little bit loose on me over time. All right, we'll also continue a crease down into the nasolabial fold. I'm not going to take it all the way down like this. That starts to get unrealistic. Some people have it, but not too many people. It's far more realistic to kind of just start it from the alar crease and then lighten your pin pressure. There we go. Just kind of get it started. And then we'll come in with a smaller brush, kind of build up the specific crease. A lot of people don't have a sharp crease like this in the nasolabial fold, especially younger people. Like this person doesn't have one, but there's definitely an indentation, and it helps to lightly add that indentation or kind of stipple it almost, circling around the corner of the mouth. There we go. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. So a little more uniquely, but you see how the pores are kind of pinching in on themselves. That does a lot for a realistic pore flow, right? Which we've already started in the way that we added the pores in the first place, but these subtle pinches or crease pinches reinforce that effect. All right, so I'm gonna always keep in mind those crease touches, but I haven't forgotten the fine wrinkles. So if we revisit our eyelid, for one, I feel like the inside corner here is a little bit broad. Let's find the eye that we were using. Where is it? Okay, here it is. All right, the wrinkle detail is pretty noticeable. It's like a pore pattern / wrinkle detail. So we did that pretty well, but I think it's a little broad. So let me grab the pinch brush with the P key, and I'm going to enable symmetry here just to pinch these wrinkles a little bit tighter, this pattern. Also going in the direction of the pore flow, right? Just tighten that up a little bit. Okay. Also, on the lower lid, I feel like I got a little too strong with the pore detail. You can see in the photo that it's much smoother. So if you need to dial back your pore detail at any point, I recommend using the fill brush. And the reason I recommend this instead of smoothing, if I hold shift and smooth out this area, it starts to feel low resolution because all the details are being washed out. And that's not really the effect I want. I just want to make the existing detail more subtle. And the fill brush works better for that. Let's make sure to keep it at a low strength, like 0.2. And I'm going to just stroke over this area. All right, you can see big difference. The pores just got less deep. And so on the opposite side of the spectrum, here's a little secret tip. If you need to deepen the existing details, earlier I said use the inflate brush, which I immediately regretted. And so I said that you could use inflate to kind of push these details out. And what happens is the details end up kind of pushing into each other. So you get bad effects like this. Instead, since recording that, I discovered that in the fill brush, which used to be called fill/deepen, now it's just fill, and the deepen behavior has sort of been hidden. In the brush menu, by default, the invert to scrape option is enabled. This means that when you hold control, it acts as the scrape brush. But if you disable that, it will work as a deepen brush, which is kind of a hidden gem. There's no real way to know that unless you're coming from an earlier version of Blender. But now if I hold control and stroke over this area, my brush is pretty subtle, so that effect was pretty subtle. But if I undo, you can see what's happening, right? So this is before and this is after the deepen effect, and the existing details just get deeper. All right, so hold control, maybe increase the brush a little bit, hold control. All right, so that's how you can soften pore details and also increase pore details if you need. And so I've softened the details in the bottom lid. I should also do that probably here as well. Just a little bit too strong. Here we go. I think I'll use the crease brush to emphasize the lower lid a bit, right? So just the subtle touches. You'll see the pores kind of pinch in. Excellent. Oh, I do have symmetry enabled. I need to keep that in mind. Which, you know, maybe I could get away with doing crow's feet and these wrinkles symmetrically. I don't think so. I think that's going to be the lazy way to go because, again, they're more noticeable than other pore details. So let's disable X symmetry. And you'll notice that there are some really fine but sharp creases stretching from the inside corner of the eye all the way down through the cheek. And I added those a little bit in the eye detailing lesson, but I can take that further, and I think that will make it more realistic. So holding control, let's get a feel. All right, it's pretty slow, a little bit laggy. It's definitely not this laggy whenever I'm not recording, but we'll just have to deal with it. I'm going to try to sort of piggyback off an existing crease. Good grief, that is really laggy. Let's increase the strength of the brush so we see the effect. Okay, there we go. I'm going to pull it all the way out towards the top of the cheekbone. All right, you can sort of see where that happened right there. All right, and let's add a few more. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Let's do the same with the crow's feet, kind of emanating from the outside of the eye. Also, these often kind of curl upward. I'm going to start out a little more subtle and then push harder towards the middle of the stroke. All right, I don't know about that top one. That's looking a little bit strong. But there's actually a lot of these creases that occur around the eye, even on younger people. Like, let's say this person is late 20s, 30s, somewhere in there. These wrinkles do appear, but they're much more subtle. And over time, as a person gets older, those deepen and increase in volume. Let's switch to the sculpt brush. Okay, and add just a tiny bit of volume here. All right, just a little bit. And I do think this one's probably a little bit too strong. So let's fill some of that in with the fill brush. There we go. Maybe pinch out what's left. And if you have too strong of a crease, it helps to just add some more subtle ones surrounding it. All right, let's make it a small brush. There we go. Keep in mind that a lot of this will be washed out or made even more subtle whenever we add the subsurface shader. So in my experience, as long as you keep them subtle, it's okay to add a lot of these wrinkles. They generally just contribute to the realism, but the deeper the wrinkles, the more prominent they are, the older the person is going to feel. So even with the subtle ones, they're going to start to feel a little bit older than they were, but it's important to keep in mind that this will be washed out once we add the material. So let's do some of that light touching around the infraorbital rim, just to deepen that crease and that anatomy, emphasize that anatomy a little bit better. Same thing on the other side. I'm just kind of like stippling the effect. And there we go. That little extra anatomy emphasis really polishes off the sculpt. All right, going back to the brow, often you see some creases. That's way too broad of a brush. Let's lower the radius. All right, that's an example of just a bad wrinkle. All right, it's way too smooth. It's too broad. It just kind of looks unnatural on the surface. Let's see if we can find a better example of these kind of creases. All right, you can just see ever so slightly a collection of wrinkles in this area, and that is way too bland looking. I might have to do this in passes, in more subtle passes than the forehead wrinkles. So just lightly touch here, kind of outlining where the brow connects into the glabella. Also cutting horizontally across the bridge of the nose. There we go. All right, so start subtly and then come back with a smaller brush, kind of emphasize the center. Don't be afraid to break the path. There we go. Once you get the hang of this, it almost feels like you're sketching these details into the surface. Like you can be a little bit looser once you get comfortable with the workflow. There we go. And it is a subtle game, but it does so much in the broad picture. And at this point, that's really the whole workflow. I just need to apply it across the entire sculpture. So I'm going to speed up the video playback and touch on the highlights of the process as we go. I've mentioned that this technique of emphasizing facial creases and divots feels a little like sketching. If you've ever sketched with pencil and paper or watched an artist do it, commonly you start with a lightly defined basic version of what you're drawing. Next, you'll revisit key landmarks with stronger pencil lines of varying pressure as you hit on key features. And this sketchy approach is similar, in my opinion, to this subtle creases pass we're applying here. As long as you keep your brush extremely low in strength, you can gesturally touch on features all over the face, and the result will feel much more polished anatomically. Once I get to the neck, the creases are very similar to the forehead wrinkles. As with most features, these wrinkle definitions will vary from person to person. They're subtle in early life and exaggerate with age. I'm often tempted to define creases in the deep crevice from jaw to neck, but they're not really that common in a lean face like this. So you can see me starting in but pulling back and leaving it subtle ultimately. It's also common to see small wrinkles in the connection from the ear to the head, both on the bottom and the top. And finally, it's time to address the left side crow's feet. Again, choosing to sculpt these independently is twice the work, but definitely worth it. If they were symmetrical, it would be quite obvious from the front view. And I know I've said it before, but these wrinkles can quickly age your face in a moment, going from early 20s to 40 if you're not careful. Just a few more crease emphasizers and I think we can give our Wacom pen a rest. Okay, I am pretty happy with this wrinkle pass. I like that the indentations are sharper now, right? They feel finished, whereas they were a bit washed out before this. And overall, it just feels polished. It feels complete. I really like the subtle indentations with the crease brush that serves to emphasize the underlying anatomy. I just have a lot of fun with these final stages. And you can tell that the person is looking older. And so if we just push this process a little more, we could add 10 years to this guy's age. And in that way, sculpting older people can be a little bit easier because you don't have to restrain yourself so much. But younger people can be difficult because a lot of these details do exist, but they're so subtle that it can be hard to strike that balance. But if they're missing entirely, the sculpture doesn't look complete. So really the difficulty does lie in achieving the right level of subtlety, but I think we've done that for the most part here. Now, I did have one more thought as I was going, and that was sometimes similar to the way that we used the large wrinkle pattern here, broadly stroked on the surface. I think I have the leftovers, right? Remember this pattern right here that we just applied to the whole thing? I also have a secondary method for that simply uses a noise texture. All right, so if we jump over to the stamp brush again and our texture settings, I'm going to add a new texture, and I just duplicated it. That's fine. We'll call it skin noise. And I call it noise, but the actual texture type is going to be the procedural clouds texture, which in Cycles and really modern Blender, this is referred to as noise. But in the old Blender textures, it was called clouds. And there is a separate noise that's basically white noise. But we're going for clouds, and let's add a fake user so we keep this around. Now, if I do a test on the surface over here, it's just a generic noisy bumpy pattern. And if we make that more subtle, like let's go to 0.15 maybe even less than that, like 0.1. Yeah, okay. And specifically, I wanted to add it to the ears because oftentimes in ears, you do get a kind of wobbly, bumpy aesthetic that goes along with it. Let's see if we can find a good image. You can sort of see it here. We've talked about how to sculpt this by hand, but I also like to add this procedurally. Let's see, I'm probably not going to find a great reference for this. Certainly not here. That ear is extremely smooth and model-like. You can see it a little bit here. It just sort of gnarls up the structure ever so slightly, okay? We're in the realm of extreme subtlety, which is kind of hard to explain, but the feeling is absolutely there in the end product. So I'm going to add it just stamping largely across the surface. That was maybe a little bit too subtle. So let's go to 0.15. All right, so now you should be able to see that effect. That is the before and after. And we can also hold control to get the basically same effect, but pushing inward. And, you know, I don't think I can resist sort of doing a pass over the entire head. So let's try that, maybe make it a little more subtle. I want it to be stronger on the ears, but yeah, that's going to be a little too obvious. So let's go down to 0.1. And yeah, that also serves to soften the surface into more tissue-like organic surface quality. All right, it's the same kind of thing where you shouldn't be able to spot it specifically, but it does contribute to the overall feel. And I can just sense the skin softening. Yeah, and I'm going to put it everywhere. But before you do this, I should have done this, is save a version of this scene before you add these kind of broad passes, or really even before you do the wrinkles, any mile marker throughout the workflow, save a version of your scene, apply your pass, and then you can decide if you like it or not. Because adding these subtle noise details are basically impossible to get rid of after you've added them. There we go. Yeah, I just love how it softens up. It feels like you could touch it and kind of push into it a little bit. It feels like skin to me. The more idealized your face is going to be, the more like a magazine model, you're not going to have this kind of detail be present. It's really more the opposite. This kind of stuff is meant to be washed out and smoothed over. But for more true realism, I recommend trying it at least. It does take the complexion away from smooth. And if you go too strong, it's going to start to feel like this person had really bad acne. And so you're seeing the residual effects of that. But I think we've hit a good balance. That was the last touch for our pore detail. So pending a subsurface shading render test, I think we're done.